Go ahead.
Do you want me to introduce myself?
If that's okay.
Hi, folks.
Okay.
My name is Robert Eyler, and I want to thank the Alliance for Workforce Development for having me today and for working with myself and Shaven Concepts on bringing this webinar to you. Here's the agenda for us today. We're going to talk about the number of cases and sort of the slow-moving curve toward the top of the hill and what that means for our economy. We're then going to talk about the economy and jobs, and we're going to have a focus on California and somewhat on Plumas County. A lot of the things we're also going to talk about are the risks that are out there and sort of thinking about the evolution of opening up our economy and what that means. And then think about where taxable sales and housing prices might be sitting as we walk into this scenario, with the idea that those are both going to be things that not only our businesses and our residents are going to be worried about, but also our municipal governments. And at the end, I'm going to tell you some data to watch. So here is a curve that shows the evolution of the cases basically since the 15th of February, when we felt like, as economists, that the beginning of this problem was starting to show its face, and then we started to ramp up with the idea that we knew it was going to get bigger and bigger. And we really started being concerned on the 1st of March. And I'll show you in a minute that also affected our equity markets. But you can see here where it went 7 or 8 days before April 20th. And there hasn't been a whole lot of change in terms of the gradient of the movement of this curve, but slowly coasting to the top of the hill. Now, our sheltering in place has, for better or for worse, affected the movement to the top of the hill, because the cases are still rising at very small increments each day, rather than starting to fall or having days where we really don't have any additional cases, and then the total caseload is sort of waiting over time to go away. But right now, the evolution of these cases is dictating a lot to our economy. That started with our equity markets changing, and you can see here, that's where we've been basically the last 12 months or so, but the last 2 months have been absolutely crazy in terms of the volatility in our markets. March was one of the worst months in market history. If you look at the last 2 recessions and you look at where the Great Recession, the shaded area in the middle of this graph, bottomed out, which I show you here, May 2009 at 735 on the S&P 500. We are somewhere in about the 2,800 range now on the S&P, creeping up on 2,900 a little bit. But that was after a really steep fall. And the fall on March 31 to 2584 that you can see marked here was a fall from 3277 at the end of February, and there was a lot of zaniness in between. So what the monthly average does not tell you is all the day-to-day volatility that happened in March. Is there were huge sell-offs, huge swings all over the place. The cases evolution that I showed you in the last graph generated a lot of uncertainty in our equity markets, and those have been reflected the last couple of months in terms of volatility. The beauty of that is starting to come back, and that's also because the markets have started to price in a couple of things I'm going to get to in the next couple of slides. One of them is we know we're going to see unemployment and relatively high numbers. Data just came out this morning about California that I'll talk about in just a second, and also for the US. California data were from last week. The US data were from the previous week, or I'm sorry, just last week. California was 2 weeks ago. But here's the evolution of both the US and California over the last basically 34 years. You can see there's 3 recessions over that time, and here's the evolution of new unemployment insurance claims in the nation overall over that time. And you can see it peaks during recessions more or less, and we've seen an amazing spike as of last week for the previous 4 weeks. And that spike has led to about 22 million people being potentially out of work. And now we think that number is going to be somewhere closer to about 27 million. So we're watching very closely to see the actual unemployment rate get told to us sometime early in May about April, because we expected April and May to be relatively ugly months in terms of the number of people being unemployed. So that spike is a precursor to unemployment, as I'll go into in just a minute. And here's the California numbers in contrast, a little bit more seasonal, a little bit more volatile, but basically following the same trends with the same peaking. And you can see the far right-hand side has the highest peak and really has just been racing up to be just about just under 600,000 this last week that was counted. The most previous 7 days is still yet to be counted. It lags the national data by 1 week, but about 2.8 million people in California potentially unemployed as of this week. Why are we thinking that that's good? Well, it's good because we're actually starting to see the negative part of this, and the positive part is still yet to come. So one of the reasons why the equity markets have rebounded is because this has become a tale of 3 policies and not just one, which is the social policy. We have a monetary policy change that took place about 3 weeks ago and has continued to evolve in terms of lower interest rates, a package of potential supports for banks to provide loans and to not worry too much about their balance sheets, and also to support consumers and businesses getting back to spending once we feel like our economic lives have been reclaimed. There's been a huge amount of fiscal policy, Congress passing bills to allow money to move from the congressional coffers through borrowing, basically to move it out to you and I and to businesses in the United States, with the hope that two things happen. One, we're able to keep our incomes basically the same level, and businesses are not going to fire people as quickly as they would have otherwise with the contraction in demand as dictated by the third policy, which is social policy. So right now we're playing this game of seeing if we can take the two policies, add them up in terms of fiscal and monetary, and make it bigger than the negative effects of the social policy that we're still enduring right now, and will continue to do so until we actually roll out from the social policy and the shelter-at-home conditions. Once that's all done, the key is that the policies are larger, and they start to fuel what we think of as multiplier effects in our economy and make their sum of parts even bigger than they would be individually. More detail on the fiscal policy side, we've seen an eligibility expansion for those that are self-employed and gig, generally would not be available to gain access to unemployment. Extended eligibility for health conditions and other job loss related to COVID-19. A lot of expanded and extended. That's the key about this latest package coming out of Congress with respect to unemployment insurance. It's done both. It's expanded the time and expanded the amount. We've seen also pandemic insurance. So just basically anybody who's gone on unemployment is going to get something more than they expected. And the key to that for businesses, and this is one of the critical factors here, is will we be able to rehire people if the benefits they receive are larger than what they might get paid? And that's a friction in public economics. That's a classic friction, but it's something we're watching very closely to see if that actually happens once the social policies and the restrictions are lifted. Business loans have been available. This has been headline news. If you are a business in Plumas County, you need to talk to your banker if you haven't already. And we already know that businesses have received checks. So the policy is working, but has not been generalized in such a way yet that everybody who wants to get their money has received it. Congress put out an initial block of money that was spent relatively quickly, way more quickly than they thought. The popularity of the program was huge, and a second tranche was just passed this week. So we will see how long that lasts and if a third one is coming. Congress is already preparing for a third. And then finally, our public sectors are going to get some help. I just saw on my email that higher education got about $47 billion, I think, across the United States to help fill in the gap from the federal government as part of these hundreds of billions of dollars coming out. But in most cases, that might just be to offset expenses. So while it is good that the federal government is looking at our counties and cities and our state governments as places where they're going to need some financial help in the front end, it might just fill the hole, and hopefully it does a little bit more than that in terms of what's happened to revenues and also expenses as a result of the social policies. So a lot of counties in California are now concerned that they're hearing about in the news that other parts of the United States are starting to open up, and especially our rural counties in California are saying to yourself, look, we have very few cases. We're in a rural place. Why are we not reopening faster, and why can't we just get this thing to show on the road? Well, let's think about that for a minute. The costs, there's short-term costs in doing that. For example, let's suppose that you did that and you did it without being fully coordinated with other places. And then people started to move around. And unfortunately, some of those people moving around don't even know that they have COVID-19, and then they bring it to Plumas. If you get any increase in infection rates after you've opened up in such a way that you did not expect, and the state of California finds that out, it's going to be a big problem. So you're going to find yourself not only dealing with the legal aspects of reopening, but also just thinking about the health and economic reasons why you'd want to reopen. Part of it is you don't want to have to engage the social contraction and keep people at home because you had cases rise faster than you would have under a more coordinated strategy statewide. It's very tricky, and I understand it, but that's a short-term risk. The medium-term risk is what happens if you have to shut back down again. There are going to be lingering impacts and a long shadow cast if you suddenly open up and then have to close again because you weren't thinking it all the way through. And then finally, the long term. Let's assume that you open up in the wrong way and you end up having businesses closed because of that second infection situation, and there's a second contraction in the way that our policies and our businesses work. It'll be very tricky to come out of that hole in the short to medium term. So what we're really trying to do is minimize the cost through these social policy choices, as painful in the short run as it may be. Our cities and counties have got to be, at least in the short term, a little bit more patient, recognizing we're not out of the woods yet. Remember, that curve I showed you is still not capped off, which means there's still, from an epidemiology standpoint, a relatively strong risk of reinfection immediately. Now, of course, we all want to open up because there's benefits. We want to get jobs and spending started again. We want to get our tax revenues flowing again. These are big deals, especially because we're looking at our budgets and we're looking at our businesses going, I don't know if I can handle this much longer. That's exactly why the policies at the federal level, both fiscal and monetary, were passed in such a quick fashion. They know that those are kind of the considerations you're making, and they don't want to see you either walk away from your job or be forced to make a decision about your workers, or for municipalities to basically just panic. They want to provide time for planning and actually just keeping people in place. The medium term is that we're kind of betting on the benefits side that we are going to have enough healthcare resources and enough knowledge to either get to a vaccine or know how to deal with it if we see a second round, and we can get our economy started sooner than later and get those medium term benefits as we move back toward where we thought we were going to be, or what I'm going to call in a minute the baseline. And in the long term, we're actually hoping this, and this is the really cool thing. We're hoping that we actually adapt and innovate in such a way that there are actually business opportunities on the other side of this thing that might live on for years to come. And that might mean added manufacturing in places where there weren't manufacturing, more healthcare jobs in places that otherwise would have been relatively slow growing in healthcare. There's a lot of possibilities here that might reduce the long-term cost of either repeat episodes or things that might come otherwise in terms of another round of a mutated virus. And our scientists are thinking about all those angles and informing our policymakers. And right now there's so much uncertainty that nobody really knows what to do. But believe you me, the California government is thinking about the two of these together and saying right now the costs still outweigh the benefits, and they're being very, very cautious because, folks, the costs of not doing this right are way bigger than the benefits. For us, folks, it's depth and duration. How deep are we going to go, and how long is it going to last? I get asked a lot of questions about how long is the recession going to last. Well, we still have to kind of see what happens on the reopening to know what the benefits of those positive policies are going to be as this negative policy, that the social contraction, shrinks in size. Right now, as I'll show you in a minute, I'm going to show you two scenarios that I think are most likely. Neither one of them has us fully recovering until after next year. And IMF, the International Monetary Fund, said the United States economy and national economy, they did a forecast they released just last week, is likely to recover before 2021. And we probably follow suit if history is any guide. But we're trying with all of our policies and really thinking forward, it's the depth and duration. We're both trying to shrink both of those. I don't want it to go too deep, and I don't want it to last too long. Well, let's look at unemployment rates. This is what unemployment looks like for the US and California since 1976. This is the US, and you can see the shaded areas are the recessions, and you can see the spiking of unemployment and then the slide back down as we grow to a bottom, and then up again we go. Sort of the classic way we think about business cycles in our economy. California basically follows the national lead, though the last three recessions, California has seen higher unemployment rates than the US on average, and has also grown faster in terms of income growth and jobs growth and median household income than the United States has on average over time as well. But when unemployment spikes, California tends to be higher than the nation. We can see here the dot-com recession and the Great Recession as examples of that gap. Now, this is where we are in the most recent data, and you can see the little nub going up, and that's because unemployment insurance claims started to creep up a little bit in March, which then led to a little higher unemployment rate. And that's where we want to start thinking, okay, well, what do those claims tell us about the future of unemployment in a way that we might be able to look at those actual people counts? And that's the beauty of the new unemployment insurance claims, is they're actually people walking in to the unemployment office and asking for that insurance money that they've paid their taxes to get. This is the point, is it's able to, in a sense, predict where we think unemployment is going. So for California, if we look at this, the unemployment rate is on the left-hand axis, and the percentage change on an annual basis of unemployment insurance claims that are new is on the right-hand axis. There's the same unemployment rate we just saw, but from 1987 forward, because those are the data we have for claims. And here are the claims data. And you can see the claims data tend to spike before the unemployment rate spikes, which means that we should be able to see unemployment fall after a certain number of months once unemployment insurance claims stop growing. But it doesn't mean let's say they haven't stopped 100% growing in volume. They've just stopped growing in terms of the percentage change from the previous year. But that's what we're really looking for. We don't want seasonality to creep into this, so we want to look at what happened last year at the same exact time. And generally speaking, it's about 20 to 24 months from that spike in, or that initial spike in unemployment insurance to the time in which unemployment itself peaks. So you can see that here in the Gulf War I recession, the dot-com recession, and the Great Recession. Now, here's Plumas County looking just at cases itself. So to kind of transition the graph a little bit more to an actual point count, when the number of cases actually gets to its maximum level in the cycle, and this is just one case, this is just the Great Recession case, it's about 5 or 6 months later that unemployment basically peaks. And the idea there is that in larger settings, you're going to have unemployment sort of continue to grow and grow slower and slower and slower, and then it's finally going to cap out, and it's not going to be as tied to, let's say, local area dynamics as, let's say, the broader economy. So for Plumas County, we should expect a longer growth period of people going on unemployment, but then ultimately a closer tie of unemployment insurance claims to the actual unemployment rate. And the claims this time are on the left axis, and the percentage unemployment rate is on the right axis. The point is, as you can see right here, it's about a 5 to 6 month gap in those peaks. What's critical is that rural California is not so much going to recover more quickly, but it's going to be more tied in terms of the claims of people who live there asking for unemployment and the actual local unemployment getting to its peak, because it's not as broad-based as a statewide economy. Regardless of all those data and thinking forward, we want to really know on the ground from an economic development standpoint, where are our factors of vulnerability? So essential businesses and businesses that are close to their customers right now are probably okay, in the sense that because we're socially distancing ourselves, some of those businesses that are allowed to remain open, and businesses like, let's say, restaurants that are able to do takeout, might have some relief from those dynamics. But our biggest issues are airlines and travel and hotels and ways that people come and visit us. So in Plumas County, you are also tied to airports. Don't think because there's not a gigantic commercial airport within 20 miles of you that airports don't matter. People fly from all over the place and end up in Plumas County. Want to think that visitors absolutely are part of the equation from all over the world in terms of coming and leaving money in the county economy. And so because of the reduction in our ability to travel by air, even by car, we're seeing obviously way fewer flows as we're slowly going into the travel season. That's a very concerning thing for places that depend on visitor income during the visitor season to sort of bridge the gap from year to year to keep their local businesses alive. So one of our biggest fears in terms of how economic development and economists are looking for at suburban and rural California is that we need to get visitors back on the move, but we have to do so in such a way that they don't infect or reinfect those communities that they visit. Healthcare shifts are not this huge boon. In other words, your hospital, while it may be gearing up for a lot of cases and look like it's booming, the reality of it is that our sheltering in place has actually muted some of those gains, and there's other outpatient and elective surgeries and other parts of the healthcare system that are not functioning because we're sheltering in place have no revenue. So healthcare is in this kind of dubious middle position right now where it is waiting to provide services and get paid, but there's a lot of services it could provide and are not being paid for right now. One of the shelter in place aspects, or one of the ways we're thinking about turning the economy back on again is allowing elective surgeries to take place. And some counties are very close to making that decision as we speak, because the number of cases have not increased to the point where the hospitals are a place where one could go for something otherwise and end up infected by COVID-19. So we will see if that starts to roll out in the next 10 or 14 days, that we're allowing elective surgeries to happen in our hospital spaces again. Government is going to be another place where vulnerability is coming, because government revenue is definitely on the decline right now. We're hoping, as we'll talk about in a little bit, property values don't decline like they did in the Great Recession in such a way to not only threaten taxable sales, but also now threaten property tax rolls. So we're watching very close for that. And then governments after this budget year are going to have to make some pretty tough decisions about how many people that they hire, whether they provide golden handshakes and transfer the current liability on their books for a worker into current liabilities for the pension system, and a lot of big questions to come across government and across folks thinking about retiring. On the worker side, our lower wage workers and our commuting workers are really the most at risk right now, including our undocumented workers. So unemployment insurance does not necessarily provide you with enough resources, if you're eligible to get it, to get around the conditions of hunger or relatively high rent. So we're watching all that and watching food banks demand. We're watching whether or not rent forbearance and deference comes into play. It's going to be very wild the next couple of months to see how many relief packages are imposed on landlords, and also what additional nonprofit resources come to bear because demand is rising so quickly for low-wage workers. All right, so let's talk about two forecasts and jobs as we start to slowly wrap up and talk more about Plumas in specific. I'm down to two scenarios right now. I was doing three earlier before the duration of the social contraction continued for a little bit longer than I thought it would. But the tricky scenario suggests that we're not going to be back probably until later 2021 toward the baseline and not quite there until 2022. And part of that's because we've taken on similar measures as China, and we are now on the borderline of recession as a result of what we're expecting to be a relatively large contraction in unemployment and a slowdown in income and other jobs to support our economy. So we're watching for that. That's part one. The second one's a more ugly scenario where instead of recovering in, let's say, a modified V shape, we're going to do more of a U-shaped recovery. And I'll show you the graphs in just a minute. The U-shaped recovery to the ugly scenario is that the situation has generalized, and to a certain extent that's true. It has generalized. The key is how we restart and whether or not we have a repeat scenario. So the equity market's coming back a little bit, and the amount of policy movement we've seen to give positive consumption and business energy to the economy once it restarts are both great things looking forward. We have to get the social constraints put aside, get back to doing normal business, and then hope we do not have a general reinfection in the fall, which would end up being another shutdown period. That's critical to getting out of the ugly scenario and back toward the tricky or a better scenario by next year. So let's look at those in terms of California. And so the baseline forecast here comes from the California Department of Finance right after the first of the year. I'm actually very humbled to be part of that group that does the final work on this with the Department of Finance's economics group. And this was our forecast looking toward 2023 as the baseline. Now, they're about to redo that forecast because of what's going on with COVID-19, but the conditions before this started really have not changed that much fundamentally until we start the economy again and really test the true damage to that baseline that's hampered. Well, the tricky scenario in terms of the number of jobs maybe looks like this. There's a sharp decline, and then in almost like a modified V shape, we're sort of wiggling back up over time to where we're back on spot here where we should have been. And hopefully you're going to see my arrow here. We're back at baseline somewhere in mid-2022. So we're getting there and we're growing after the deep decline, but we're not kind of back to where we started until early 2022 and back at baseline until later in 2022. So in theory, the tricky scenario might be a good scenario thinking about the ugly, which is this, which is more of a U-shape where we have a sharp downturn, a flat period exacerbated by a reinfection here, and then slowly moving up the ladder, maybe a little bit more quickly toward 2023, but really not back until the end of 2023. So the thing that's really nasty about that ugly scenario, if it plays out in these magnitudes, is that if these are the last two recessions, and this is what the Great Recession looked like, we are blasted back in the ugly scenario to about 2015 level jobs, and the movement looks more sharp and potentially about as deep as the Great Recession. So we've been thinking about whether or not we were going to have a repeat of the Great Recession since the Great Recession ended. I've been asked that question 250 million times. But for this episode, we probably were going to avoid that. It was going to probably be a mild recession if and when it came. Well, I shouldn't say if and when it came. The fact that this episode has forced this, believe it or not, there could be some positivity, as I spoke about before, in terms of the benefits, is it could force change in our economy structurally that was sort of slowly waiting to happen. And we will see, unfortunately, it's going to come at a price with a lot of jobs and income, and that's going to be a nasty process to go through. So hopefully we'll avoid the ugly scenario, be closer to the tricky, and maybe slightly better because policy has been so massive. For Plumas, we're going to follow basically the same thing. This is the evolution of jobs in Plumas County since 2000, and I actually extended the forecast forward to follow the normal trends and the way it's connected to the California economy in Plumas County. And you can see here's the tricky scenario and the ugly scenario. Now here's the key. You notice in the California ugly scenario, there was a double dip. Well, in Plumas, because it's more rural, I don't expect a double dip. I expect that we might have some wobbliness if the California economy double dips, but locally it won't be as bad because if the dip happens, it'll happen off tourism season. So notice that it's just a little bit worse than the tricky scenario initially, but because of the ugliness in the California economy, if the ugly scenario happens, it's going to drag a little longer to get back to baseline. But it gets there a little bit more quickly than the California economy. And notice that, in fact, we are back above the original spot we were at. If the blue shape goes down and then knifes back up, it's a lot more V-shaped in Plumas because the downturn is not as steep. So in rural California, there's a little bit of positivity around where we might go, because the urban areas are not only more susceptible to reinfection and more draconian continuance of social conditions based on being urban places, but they're also a place where the job losses can lead to a lot more frictions in the economy because there's so many different angles that need global connections to work. If we can't fly out of our urban areas and we can't get goods from all over the world because we're still worried about people and goods movement around the disease, it's going to slow our cities down, which could leak into rural areas over time, but probably will not leak into rural areas in the short to medium term. And the real positivity piece, and this is something that is really stretching it a little bit, is that because we're not going to fly as much probably on the front end of coming out of the social conditions that we're in right now, our rural areas may find increased demand for tourism if people can go someplace that's basically infection free and go someplace that's out of the house because they've been in the house so long. So our rural areas in California may actually see a little bit more action than they expected anyway. And then hopefully we're going to get through fire season without a whole lot of trouble. We'll see. I did not have a major fire in Plumas County as part of this or anywhere in California in terms of upsetting that part of our economy later in the year. There's our two recessions to give you some historic perspective. Now, thinking about triage. So if you're in economic development and you're engaged, as I know the Alliance is, one thing we've been doing is trying to provide some guidance as to where, when you come out of the turn, you need to focus your economic development energy. Obviously, tourism is one of the biggest ones. There's going to be a lot of competition for tourism dollars once people start moving around again. And a lot of that in rural California is centered on our downtowns, where people tend to congregate, where there's bars, restaurants, and things that people come to go to either shop or just kind of to get to know the local people or just hang out someplace. Those are the places that are going to absolutely be on the front line of the most pain in this scenario, not only because that there'll be a lower flow of visitors, but they're also going to be our local merchants who are locally owned, who are going to be hurting as a result of this and not be able to fall back on a broader corporate structure or a chain. Commercial and housing construction is another one. We know that a lot of places have had no restriction on construction, some have. Whether or not the demand is there on the other side is actually the critical issue. Even if you're an essential business now and you're doing construction, we don't know how long the demand will be there for continued projects, whether they be renovation or new projects from the ground up. There may be some real challenges for construction over the next couple of years, depending on how we come out of this. Thinking about sales tax, you think about on the municipal side, sales taxes in Plumas County kind of follow the state on average. There's not that much difference here. That's kicked up a little bit over the last decade. This is from 2009 forward on a quarterly basis, but more or less following the state. So not a whole lot of additional riskiness here. On the housing market side, we've seen housing prices slowly move up, and since the bottom, Plumas has seen gains like a lot of parts of the state, but because it's rural and it's kind of a little bit farther away from most of our urban areas, it hasn't grown like the state the last couple of years or since we hit the bottom after the Great Recession. But there's been growth. So one of the things you're going to have is a lot of contention in county chambers about what is going to happen if we start to see housing prices dip. Are property tax rolls going to go down, which would be another revenue hit for the municipality, but it's going to be relief for the homeowner? And how does this change the construction dynamics over time if population slowly starts to grow? Or, for example, if we're thinking about how workers are going to be able to live locally because of the geography of rural California and trying to provide a place for people to come and stay. One of the potential beauties of this change is that we might actually see more investments in broadband, to allow people to move from what is currently an urban area into a more rural area and basically do their work in the rural setting and bring all that income with them. Some of your neighbors may not like that strategy, but it's certainly things that economic development professionals are going to be thinking about in rural California, because it's something since the Great Recession, a lot of them have been considering is how do we attract a younger, family-oriented audience to our area to provide workforce development and economic development opportunities for decades to come and not just a couple of years. Housing markets can help propel some of that. So just to break it down from a municipal standpoint, taxable sales are likely to fall. We're hoping there's not a construction slowdown. We're hoping there's not a property tax shock. We know there's going to be additional costs, and we're concerned about public safety. And this is mainly in the urban areas, but we may or may not see things in the rural areas as things linger on in terms of the social contraction. And then finally, and this is key, we rely on government for a lot. And one of the things that this crisis might do is it might lead a lot of people who are eligible to retire to make that final choice and go in before they might think that there's going to be a change in their benefits package if they don't jump into that pool. Now, it just so happens that most people, when they start their job, they kind of lock what their benefits are going to be. So thinking that that's going to change would take lawsuits, an enormous amount of convolution to get through. So you shouldn't worry about that. But you might see people say, I just don't want to deal with it anymore, and I'm now going to elect to retire. And I'm also concerned about my wealth, and I needed to completely change my total life to be able to take advantage of what wealth I have. And that might also mean selling a home. So when your local area might have more government workers or be somewhat disproportionate in terms of government workers, you need to watch how the evolution of our pension systems lead to changes in people actually staying at work, or governments thinking about providing golden handshakes to clean up their current books. And that can change the way social services work with our local communities. So to wrap up, short-term indicators of change. As I said, these are the latest data. The US data just changed and added another 4.4, so just under 27 million people now have gone up for unemployment in the last 5 weeks. In California, that same period's about 2.8 million. And we're watching very closely the evolution of those claims against what actually is reported in employment, and also the average hours worked and the amount of people that are, or amount of businesses are still asking for workers. The combination of all those pieces should tell us a lot about the labor market. And they all come out at different times, but right now we're just waiting to see how deep we're going to go. And that can help at least start telling us, once the social policy is lifted, how much work we got to do to get the duration shortened. The summer is going to be a big thing for local economies. So if you are somebody who owns a tourism-based business or thinking about how tourism is going to play out in your local economy, specifically in Plumas County, it's going to be a tricky summer. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But there are some things you can do now from an economic development standpoint to provide some competitive level that's augmented out there, even though the competition is going to go up. Will you see people want to utilize rural California because they can't travel some other place by plane in the short term? Think about that in terms of your strategies. Finally, folks, it's all going to boil down to cases. If we don't see these cases peak and start to fall, we're going to be living under sort of some variation of the current situation for some time to come. I've heard everything out there. There is no date set by the California government to generalize the lifting. There are counties who are, again, contending with what they could do because they've seen so few cases. But reinfection, folks, is going to be a big problem for anybody if it happens. So we've watched Singapore and South Korea go through some experiments and seen some reinfection, and that's signaling to our federal and state governments what we should or should not be doing. But we know there are governments out there, including state governments, that have started to slowly lift those conditions because the caseload has gotten a slower growth rate. And then finally, folks, that policy is going to dictate everything. So as you're thinking about change in Plumas, just think about what you need to be concerned. What's going to happen for the summer? How can you shape the coming out party in such a way that gives you the best shot at a winner and not have those costs come and get you in the short and medium term? That's really the key going forward for right now. So I'll take some questions. Vicki, if you've got some questions, this would be a great time.
Okay, I have one question, and those of you listening in, if you just want to use that chat version or the chat feature to submit your questions, that would be great. Rob, you had said earlier something about the additional demands that may be put on landlords. I'm assuming that's security related demands. Wouldn't you see that as a potential for increasing rents unless there's some stop measures put in place?
I think actually, Vicki, what you might see is that if you have a lot of people that are unemployed and there's a lot of concern over people becoming marginally homeless that are renting right now otherwise, you might see the state government generalize some kind of short-term rent control as to not allow that to happen even if costs are rising, or potentially allow people to stay in their apartment for 30 days with no rent, where the state government will either come in and potentially subsidize the landlord or just say that this is kind of the cost of doing business. Those have all swirled around Sacramento as potential outcomes. That's what I meant by that comment, that if we think of renters as being relatively more vulnerable to shocks like this than people that own their homes, because we already know that lenders are being, in a sense, subsidized to provide some kind of relief to homeowners if they get into economic trouble, so we do not repeat the episodes we saw in 2007, 8, and 9.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Okay, I show no other questions. Oh, wait a minute. Here's one. Inflation. What are the anticipated impacts on recovery, such as jobs, new businesses, recovering business, cost of goods, etc., inflation will certainly have an impact.
That's an outstanding question. So one of the most baffling things, though we have generated an explanation of this as economists over the last few years, is that we saw such fiscal and monetary expansion happen at the bottom or toward the bottom of the Great Recession in an attempt to revive our economy, that a lot of us were contending that we would see, let's say, higher than average inflation pressure 3 or 4 years on in the 2010s. That never happened. And in fact, inflation has remained relatively in check for the last, basically 25 to 28 years. We have really not seen much change in inflation since the late 1980s in earnest. And part of that's because monetary policy has gotten better and it sort of, in a sense, shaping inflation. But the other piece of it is that we've seen the globe really become a marketplace. So we've heard, the idea about the world is flat, but now we've actually flattened that world even more the last 10 years. And price pressure has just not been there because there's been such competition for goods, and our recovery has also been relatively slow. So when you have more supplied and more variation on that supply and more competition, at the same time that demand side of the equation is rising more slowly, it's easy for prices to remain relatively slow growing and really somewhat flat in some cases. You just don't have the two sides of the equation. However, here we go again with another huge round of money being printed basically to pay for lending that the government wants to do to use fiscal policy. And basically the Federal Reserve is paying for a lot of the fiscal policy and sort of this, classic so-called policy accommodation move. And a lot of that's meant to generate more consumption by businesses and households in such a way to generate more inflation. So we will see what happens over the next 3 or 4 years, if that actually comes to fruit or not. But right now, with such a demand sag, we may not see much inflation pressure because of that demand force dragging prices down.
Broadband access is huge. It's a huge challenge for the Plumas area, the more rural areas. Do you anticipate seeing anything in the future in the way of incentives that would improve that service?
That's a great question. So, I know that rural California has been a place, there's been a lot of contention about broadband and bringing higher speed internet to all places around California. There's been some rumblings in Sacramento about generalizing high-speed internet, maybe using 5G and maybe partnerships with big providers to do that. Nothing's really come to fruit yet. Now, what we might see as a result of this is we actually might see federal money come in hard and say, we now need to get the entirety of the country on high-speed internet for two major reasons. One is because due to potential social contractions, we're concerned that you can't do your work. And if your work is portable, by the nature of having relatively decent broadband at home, would that allow you to shelter in place and stay at the same level of productivity? And the federal government would like to help on that. So we should assume that they're thinking about that in Washington and in Sacramento as a way of keeping us as productive under different, let's say, social conditions in the future than what we had to sort of react to in a few weeks now. And the second piece is telehealth. So another big deal in rural California is being able to access healthcare options and just being able to talk to a medical professional when you don't have that many locally, if you have an upswing quickly in medical cases. So it might be that telehealth is something that also generates a lot of momentum to generalize high-speed internet and broadband availability throughout not only rural California, but the rural United States. And while there are some options, they have not necessarily been generalized, and that'll be something the federal government will think about as well.
Okay, I think we have time for this one last question. There are major differences in the different rural counties that are served by AFWD. Do you see these counties moving as a region in their recovery with similar economic forecasts?
That's an outstanding question. So while all the counties are rural, one problem or one change is that you might have a little bit more of a governmental feel in one than another. For example, if a prison is in your county or not, that might provide a different dynamic because the number of people that are involved either directly or indirectly with the prison or with an Air Force base or with another military installation or with some other large government presence, that can help during a time of these kind of movements to stabilize your economy. The problem is that on 3 or 4 years from now, you should be asking, what can we do to diversify against just that one major employer to give us a little bit more flexibility in our economy rather than relying on federal budgets. And that's a constant friction in rural California around the government. So the forecasts are slightly different where there's a little bit more of a government presence, but generally speaking, the same dynamics are basically going to be in play. Government is not going to be out of the equation in terms of having to make some tough decisions about employment either. So we actually might see a lot of things change in the way that our government installations and government systems work, whether they be prisons or military installations, going forward to where, while historically it's been kind of a rock, it might be a smaller rock going forward as a result of budget contractions. We will see. But the forecast, usually if they're going to vary along the lines of having one major employer or where government's a larger presence.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Eyler. This webinar has been recorded and it should be on the AFWD website later today or by tomorrow at any rate. So if you've missed it, if you've missed part of it, if you know anybody who wanted to attend but was not able, direct them to the AFWD website and get all your questions answered. Thank you again, Dr. Eyler.
Thank you, and I want to thank the Alliance again for sponsoring this, and thank everybody for coming today. Take care and stay healthy.
Thank you.